1 coin, Victor Harrow said, and the whole winter market laughed as if a human soul had just been weighed and found lighter than snow. The copper piece slipped from his gloved fingers and struck the frozen stone at Clara Whitmore's bare feet, spinning once, twice, then falling still beside the hem of her gray dress. Above her, the auction bell hung from the old Frostmere Tower, black against a sky the color of steel. Around her, merchants tucked their hands into fur-lined coats. Pack elders watched from beneath polished masks of respectability, and curious strangers leaned closer to see the silent Omega who had been brought to the block before sunrise. Clara did not lower her head. She wanted to. Every instinct in her small body begged her to fold inward, to become the quiet shadow they had always preferred her to be. But she kept her chin lifted, even as the silver cord around her wrists bit coldly through the thin cloth wrapped around her skin. She had learned, long ago, that silence could be mistaken for surrender. She had also learned to let people make that mistake. Victor stepped beside her with the auction papers held high, his smile bright and cruel in the torchlight. "Clara Whitmore," he announced, his voice carrying across the square. "Unclaimed Omega. No spoken voice. No proven wolf. Transferred by lawful family signature to settle outstanding debts." The words moved through the crowd like a winter draft, raising whispers wherever they passed. Unclaimed. Silent. Worthless. Clara heard all of it. She always did. People assumed that because she did not speak, the world reached her more softly. They were wrong. Sound had teeth. It could scrape, pinch, follow a person home and curl beneath the ribs. She remembered the night her voice disappeared, the night her mother's healing room went cold, the night the pack stopped calling her gifted and began calling her strange. Since then, every insult had found a place inside her, not as poison, but as proof. Proof that people feared what they could not name. Victor lowered the parchment and leaned close enough for only her to hear. "Smile, girl. A buyer likes obedience." Clara's fingers tightened around the thin silver bracelet hidden beneath her sleeve, the last thing her mother had ever fastened around her wrist. The bracelet was warm despite the cold. It had always been warm when she was afraid. Across the square, someone laughed again. "1 coin is generous," a man called out. "She can't even beg." A few others joined in, and the sound rolled over the stones, careless and easy. Clara's cheeks burned, but her eyes stayed open. She looked past the crowd, past the carts and the chained gate, toward the northern road where pine trees climbed the white hills beyond Frostmere. Somewhere out there stood the Blackthorn capital, where the Alpha King ruled from a citadel carved into the mountain. Mothers whispered his name to frighten reckless children. Alphas lowered their voices when they spoke of him. Adrian Blackthorn, the Winter Crown, the king who could silence a hall without raising his voice. Clara had never seen him. A girl like her did not come close to kings unless she was sweeping ashes from a hearth after they passed. The bell above the market gave a low groan as wind moved through it. Victor lifted the papers again. "Final call," he said. "The silent Omega of Whitmore Pack, sold for 1 coin." Clara stared at the copper piece near her foot, small, dull, almost swallowed by frost. That was what they had chosen to make of her life. A number, a debt, a line of ink. Then, at the far edge of the market, the crowd went still. Not quiet at first. Still. The kind of stillness that came before a storm crossed open land. Boots sounded against the stone, slow and certain. Clara did not turn right away, but her breath caught as every wolf in the square lowered their gaze one by one. A shadow fell across the copper coin. Then a man's voice, deep and cold as the northern mountains, cut through the market. "Who signed those papers?" For one heartbeat, no one answered him. The question hung over the Frostmere market like a blade of ice, clean and bright and impossible to ignore. Clara felt the shift before she understood it. The people who had laughed a moment ago now stared at the stones, at their boots, at anything except the tall man standing at the edge of the auction block. He wore a black traveling coat dusted with snow, simple enough for a northern nobleman, but nothing about him felt simple. Power moved with him, quiet and controlled, like a winter river beneath a sheet of glass. His hair was dark, his face sharp and pale beneath the gray morning light, and his eyes held the cold silver of a moon reflected on frozen water. Victor Harrow's smile faltered, then returned too quickly. "My lord, this is a lawful settlement," he said, smoothing the front of his coat with fingers that had begun to tremble. The girl was transferred by her guardian. There is no need for royal concern. The stranger stepped closer, and every torch seemed to lean away from him. I did not ask if you thought it was lawful, he said. I asked who signed the papers. Clara's breath clouded before her lips. She did not know why the sound of his voice made the bracelet under her sleeve pulse with warmth. She only knew that for the first time since dawn, the cold no longer felt like the strongest thing in the square. Victor looked toward the crowd. Near the front, Marlene Whitmore stood wrapped in a fox fur cloak that had once belonged to Clara's mother. Clara recognized the clasp at the throat, a silver moon with tiny stars around it. Her mother had worn it on healing days, when neighbors came with feverish children, sprained wrists, and tired hearts. Marlene wore it now like a prize. I did, Marlene said, lifting her chin, though her voice was thin. I am her legal guardian. Her mother left debts. The pact cannot carry useless mouths through another winter. Clara's hands tightened behind her. Useless. The old word landed softly this time, almost familiar. She saw herself at 12 years old, standing in her mother's healing room after the funeral, unable to force a single word through her throat while adults whispered that grief had broken something inside her. She saw herself at 15, calming a frightened foal with one touch, only to have Marlene yank her hand away and call it a trick. She saw every dinner where she had been given the smallest portion, every ceremony where she had been told to stand behind pillars, every morning when people spoke over her as if silence meant absence. The stranger's gaze moved from Marlene back to Clara. It did not slide past her. It did not measure her like merchandise. It stopped on her face as if he had found a sentence half-written and wanted the rest. Can she answer for herself? He asked. Victor laughed once, stiffly. She does not speak. That was not my question. The words were quiet, but the market heard them. Clara felt something open inside her chest, small and dangerous as a candle being lit in a sealed room. Victor snatched the parchment from his assistant and held it out. Her condition is listed plainly. Silent since childhood. No recorded mate sent. No completed shift. Her family has certified her as dependent property. The last word made the bracelet burn hotter. Clara looked down, and beneath the cuff of her sleeve, a faint silver glow threaded around the old metal. She pulled her wrist closer to hide it. Too late. The stranger saw. His expression did not change, but the air around him sharpened. Remove the cord from her wrists, he said. Victor stiffened. My lord, until purchase is complete, she remains secured. The man finally looked at him fully. The square seemed to shrink beneath that stare. Then complete nothing. Marlene stepped forward, panic flashing across her face. She belongs to Whitmore Pack. We have the right to settle our debts. Clara wanted to tell them the truth, that the debts were not her mother's, that the ledger had been changed after the funeral, that she had seen Victor and Marlene whispering over ink in the kitchen 2 nights before. But wanting had never been enough to make sound. So she did the only thing she could. She lifted her bound hands and turned her palm outward. On her skin, written in faded charcoal before they dragged her from home, were 4 uneven words. I am not property. The stranger read them. Something ancient and furious moved behind his silver eyes, not loud, not wild, but controlled so tightly it made the silence tremble. No, he said, and this time his voice carried to every corner of Frostmere. She is not. The words struck the market harder than any shouted command could have. Clara watched them pass from face to face, changing the shape of the morning. The merchants who had leaned forward for entertainment now stepped back, as if the frozen stones had shifted beneath them. The elders of minor packs lowered their eyes. Even Victor Harrow's assistants, men who had spent the sunrise arranging papers and ropes as if lives were no different from barrels of grain, suddenly found reasons to look away. Clara kept her hand raised, the charcoal sentence exposed to the cold. I am not property. The letters were smudged from snow and fear, but they were still there. They were the closest thing to a scream she had left. The stranger moved toward the auction block, and this time no one blocked his path. With each step, the truth of him became harder to ignore. Beneath the plain black coat was a posture born not from pride, but command. He did not need jewels, guards, or a crown to make the crowd remember who ruled the North. He stopped at the base of the stone platform and lifted one gloved hand. The cord, he said. Victor swallowed. My lord, I must insist that procedure be followed. The stranger's gaze did not move. Procedure does not outrank royal law. A tremor ran through the square. Royal law? Clara felt those words settle over her like the first hint of shelter. Victor's face lost its color. Marlene took half a step backward, clutching the moon clasp at her throat. A whisper began at the edge of the crowd, low at first, then spreading like wind through dry leaves. Blackthorn, the Winter Crown, the Alpha King. Clara had heard the name 100 times in warnings and fireside stories, but none of those stories had prepared her for the stillness of the man standing before her. King Adrian Blackthorn did not look like a monster from a cautionary tale. He looked like judgment wrapped in human skin, cold enough to frighten the cruel, steady enough to make the helpless breathe again. Victor bowed so quickly that his hat nearly slipped. Your Majesty, forgive me. Had I known you were present, I would have prepared a proper welcome. Adrian did not acknowledge the bow. Had you known I was present, you would have hidden the girl. The silence that followed was sharper than the winter air. Clara's eyes flicked to Marlene. Her guardian's mouth tightened, but fear had already begun to crack through the anger. Your Majesty, Marlene said, forcing a careful smile. This is a private family matter. Clara has been cared for at great personal cost. She cannot speak, cannot provide, cannot contribute to pack standing. We only seek to resolve what is owed. Adrian looked at Clara again, not at her wrists, not at the smudged words, at her face. The attention was almost unbearable because it asked nothing and stole nothing. It simply waited. Clara's throat ached with all the words buried there. She wanted to tell him about the ledger hidden beneath the kitchen floorboard, about the false debt, about the night she saw Marlene press her mother's seal into wet ink. She wanted to say that her silence was not emptiness, that her mother had told her some voices were not made for noise, that healing could pass through hands, through breath, through mercy. But the square was full of watching eyes, and her voice remained locked behind the same invisible door. So she lowered her raised palm and touched the bracelet beneath her sleeve. The silver warmed instantly, and a soft light pulsed through the cuff. Adrian saw it. So did Victor. Greed flashed across the auctioneer's face before he could hide it. That bracelet is part of the transferred property, Victor said quickly. A family trinket of possible value. It is listed in the papers. For the first time, Adrian's composure changed. Only slightly. His jaw tightened, and the air seemed to drop 10 degrees. You listed her mother's keepsake as inventory? Victor opened his mouth, then closed it. Clara pulled her bound hands to her chest, protecting the bracelet as if it were a living thing. Adrian stepped onto the platform. He was close now, close enough that Clara caught the clean scent of pine, frost, and winter smoke. He did not reach for her without permission. Instead, he held out his hand, palm up, waiting. The choice was small. To the crowd, it was nothing. To Clara, it was the first choice anyone had given her in years. Slowly, she placed her bound hands in his. The silver cord loosened at his touch, not breaking, not burning, simply falling away as if it had never had the right to hold her. A gasp moved through Frostmere. Clara stared at her freed wrists, then at the king. Adrian's voice lowered, meant for her alone, but still clear enough for the front rows to hear. You have been silent long enough for others to lie in your place. Clara's eyes stung. Behind him, Victor clutched the auction papers to his chest like a shield. Adrian turned toward him. Bring me every document bearing her name. Victor hesitated. The king's silver eyes hardened. Now, Victor moved as if the cold had entered his bones. He gathered the documents from the small iron table beside the auction block, each page stamped, folded, and tied with a strip of black ribbon. Clara watched his hands carefully. She had spent years studying hands because mouths had so often lied to her. Marlene's hands tightened when she wanted something. Victor's fingers twitched when he hit a bargain. Her mother's hands had always been warm, even in winter, and they had taught Clara that gentleness could be a language no one could forbid. Now Victor's hands shook as he placed the papers into Adrian Blackthorn's waiting palm. Everything is in order, Your Majesty, he said, though his voice had lost its smooth edge. The debt record, the guardian transfer, the auction authorization, the inventory of personal effects. All witnessed according to Frostmere custom. Adrian looked down at the bundle, but did not untie it at once. Frostmere custom does not stand above the crown. Victor bowed his head. Of course. Nor does family custom. Adrian's eyes shifted to Marlene. Nor does desperation. Marlene stiffened. Snow had begun to fall more steadily, settling on the shoulders of the crowd, soft and pale against dark wool coats. Clara stood beside the king on the platform, free of the cord but not free of the weight pressing against her chest. The market was watching her differently now. Not kindly. Not yet. But with uncertainty, and uncertainty was a crack in the wall they had built around her. Adrian untied the ribbon and opened the first page. His gaze moved over the ink with unnerving patience. No one spoke. A horse stamped near the gate. Somewhere behind the crowd, a child coughed and was quickly hushed. Clara felt the bracelet pulse again. She slid her thumb over its worn edge, and a memory rose so clearly she almost smelled lavender and candle smoke. Her mother, Evelyn Whitmore, bending close over a table covered with herbs. "Listen with your skin, little moon," she had whispered, guiding Clara's small hand over a sleeping bird with a bent wing. The body tells the truth before the mouth does. Clara had been 7 then. She had still spoken in those days, asking too many questions, laughing too loudly, singing to injured animals until they stopped trembling. By 12, the songs had disappeared. By 13, her voice was a locked room. By 16, the pack had decided a locked room was the same as an empty one. Adrian turned to the second page. His expression remained still, but something in the air changed. This debt was assigned to Evelyn Whitmore's estate 5 years after her death. Victor's eyes flicked toward Marlene. It was quick, but Clara saw it. So did Adrian. "A clerical delay," Victor said. "The northern villages are not known for perfect record-keeping." Adrian turned another page. "The seal on this transfer is old." Marlene's face tightened. "It was my sister's household seal. It passed to me when she died." Clara's fingers curled. "No." The word rang inside her with painful force. "No." Her mother had hidden that seal after Marlene tried to sell their cottage. Clara had seen it wrapped in blue cloth beneath the loose kitchen floorboard, beside the true ledger and a pressed white flower. 2 nights ago, she had watched Marlene kneel in the dark and take it. Clara stepped forward before fear could stop her. The platform creaked under her small movement. Every eye turned. Her throat tightened, but she did not try to speak. Instead, she pointed to the seal mark on the paper, then touched her bracelet, then pressed 2 fingers over her heart. Marlene gave a brittle laugh. "As you can see, Your Majesty, she gestures when she is upset. It means nothing." Clara shook her head once. The movement was small, but sharp. Adrian watched her with complete attention. "Do you know where the original ledger is?" he asked. Clara looked at him, startled. He had understood. Not all of it, maybe, but enough. Her eyes moved beyond the square, toward the northern road, toward the life she had been dragged from before dawn. She nodded. Marlene stepped forward. "This is absurd. You cannot take the word of a girl who cannot give one." Adrian closed the paper slowly. "I do not need her voice to recognize fear in yours." The crowd murmured. Marlene's mouth opened, then shut. Victor tried again, desperation sharpening his tone. "Your Majesty, the auction has already concluded. The coin was accepted. By local custom, the transfer is complete." Adrian looked at the copper coin still lying near Clara's feet. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. Then he bent, picked it up, and placed it in Victor's hand. "There," he said. "Your coin is returned." Victor stared down at it, as if it had become too heavy to hold. Adrian lifted the auction papers high enough for all of Frostmere to see. His voice carried without effort, calm and colder than the falling snow. "And this transfer is void." The word void moved through the square like a bell no one had expected to hear. For a moment, Frostmere forgot how to breathe. Clara stood beside Adrian Blackthorne with snow gathering in her hair and the old bracelet burning warm against her wrist, watching Victor Harrow's face collapse from confidence into disbelief. The auction papers remained in the king's hand, their black ribbon hanging loose, their stamped seals suddenly looking small and foolish beneath the gray morning sky. "You cannot simply erase a lawful contract," Victor said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Adrian's eyes stayed on the crowd, not on Victor. "A contract built on false debt, stolen seals, and the sale of a citizen is not lawful. It is evidence." The word evidence made several men near the back shift uneasily. Clara saw it. She saw the fur merchant who had bid on 3 frightened omegas before sunrise suddenly pull his scarf higher. She saw one of Victor's clerks take a slow step away from the iron table. She saw Marlene touch the moon clasp at her throat, not with pride now, but with panic. Adrian lowered the papers and looked at Clara. "You said the ledger is at Whitmore House." He did not phrase it as a question, and still he waited for her answer. Clara nodded once. The movement felt different now, less like permission, more like testimony. Adrian turned to the nearest royal guard, a broad-shouldered woman in a dark cloak who had been standing unseen near the market gate. Clara had not noticed her before, nor the 2 others positioned by the tower steps. The king had not come alone. He had come prepared. "Captain Rowan," Adrian said, "seal the auction records. No document leaves this square. No clerk alters a line. Send 2 riders to Whitmore House for the original ledger beneath the kitchen floorboards." Clara's breath caught. Beneath the kitchen floorboards. He had understood that too. Captain Rowan bowed. "Yes, Your Majesty." Marlene pushed forward, her composure finally breaking. "This is outrageous. You cannot search my home based on gestures and childish accusations." Adrian faced her, and the square quieted so completely that Clara could hear snow landing on the wooden rail behind her. "I can search any property connected to a royal investigation of forced transfer, forged debt, and illegal auction practice." Marlene's lips parted, but no sound came. Clara knew that feeling. She knew the terrible helplessness of having truth trapped inside, while others decided what the world would believe. But now the silence belonged to Marlene, and it did not protect her. It exposed her. Victor tried to fold the coin into his palm, as if hiding it would undo the mourning. Adrian noticed. "Leave it visible." Victor froze. The copper piece lay in his open hand, dull and ordinary, and somehow more damning than all the stamped papers on the table. Clara looked at it and felt the first strange loosening inside her chest. Not joy. Not yet. Joy was too far away, too bright to trust. What came instead was the fragile ache of being seen. Adrian stepped closer to her, careful not to crowd her. "Were there others sold here this week?" he asked softly. Clara's eyes moved to the side of the platform. There, behind a canvas screen, 3 young omegas sat huddled together on a bench, wrapped in thin blankets, their faces pale with cold and fear. One of them was only a child, perhaps 9 years old, clutching a wooden rabbit with one missing ear. Clara had noticed her earlier, before the coin, before the king, before the world changed. The little girl had slipped on the icy step, and one of Victor's men had scolded her sharply enough to make her shrink into herself. Clara had wanted to reach her then. She had not been able to. Now she could. Clara stepped away from Adrian and crossed the platform. The crowd watched, puzzled, as she knelt before the child and gently adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. The girl stared at Clara with wide brown eyes. "Are we in trouble?" she whispered. Clara shook her head. Her fingers moved to the bracelet, then to the child's wooden rabbit, then over her own heart. The girl seemed to understand enough. Her small shoulders lowered. Adrian watched from behind, and something in his expression shifted, not softer exactly, but deeper, as if the sight had reached a locked place in him. Then he turned to the market. "Every person held for sale here is under Crown protection until their cases are reviewed." A murmur rose, frightened and uncertain. Victor's face tightened. "Your Majesty, that will disrupt half the winter settlements in the northern trade routes." Adrian's gaze cut to him. "Good." The single word landed with quiet force. Clara remained kneeling before the child, but her bracelet had begun to glow again, brighter this time, silver light threading around her wrist and spilling faintly across the wooden boards. The little girl gasped. So did Captain Rowan. Adrian went still. Clara looked down in alarm, trying to cover the light, but it slipped between her fingers like moonlight through water. From somewhere in the crowd, an old woman whispered, "Moon Healer." The name passed through the square faster than fear. Moon Healer. Clara had heard it only once, from her mother, spoken like a bedtime story and a warning. Adrian took one step toward her, his silver eyes fixed on the bracelet, but his voice remained gentle. "Clara," he said, speaking her name as if it already mattered to the crown. "What did your mother leave you?" Clara stared at Adrian, his question reaching into places no one had touched since her mother's last winter. "What did your mother leave you?" The market faded at the edges, replaced by the memory of a small cottage warmed by a brick fireplace, jars of lavender and sage along the shelves, and Evelyn Whitmore's hands closing the silver bracelet around Clara's wrist. "Never let anyone take this from you," her mother had whispered. "It remembers what blood forgets." Clara had not understood then. She had only understood that her mother looked tired, that the candlelight made her skin seem almost transparent, and that every adult in Whitmore pack had started speaking in lowered voices whenever Clara entered a room. Now, kneeling on the auction platform with a frightened child in front of her and a king behind her, Clara finally felt the bracelet waking like something that had waited years for the right breath. The silver glow spread over her hand, soft and clean, not bright enough to hurt the eyes, but impossible to deny. The little girl with the wooden rabbit lifted her fingers toward it, then stopped, asking without words. Clara nodded. The child touched the light, and the trembling in her shoulders eased. A hush fell over the square. This was not a spectacle anymore. It was a confession the world had not meant to hear. Adrian stepped nearer, but still gave Clara space, as if he understood that the first gift of freedom was not rescue, but room to choose. Moon healers were believed lost after the Ashen War, Captain Rowan said quietly, her voice careful with wonder. Their line served the first Northern kings. Victor gave a strained laugh, far too loud. Old stories. Market superstition. A glowing trinket does not make her anything more than what her papers say. Clara looked up at him, and for the first time in years, she did not feel smaller beneath his voice. The bracelet warmed, and a thin thread of light moved from her wrist to the child's wooden rabbit, tracing the cracked ear, filling the split with a shimmer that faded almost as soon as it appeared. When the light was gone, the toy was whole. The child gasped, then hugged it to her chest. The crowd broke into whispers. Clara pulled her hand back, startled by her own power, but Adrian's voice steadied the air before fear could take root. "Careful," he said to the crowd, not to Clara. "What you are witnessing is not a trick for your judgment." His gaze moved across their faces. "It is a gift you nearly let men sell for a coin." The shame that followed was quiet, and somehow heavier than anger. Marlene's face had gone pale beneath her powder. Clara saw her fingers twitch toward the moon clasp again, the stolen clasp, the last visible piece of Evelyn Whitmore that had not yet been returned. Adrian noticed where Clara was looking. "That clasp," he said. Marlene stiffened. "It is mine." Clara shook her head. This time, the denial came faster, sharper, full of the voice she could not release. She pointed to the clasp, then to the bracelet, then to herself. Adrian held out his hand to Marlene. "Return it." "Your Majesty, this is humiliating." "No," Adrian said. "Humiliation is standing a girl on a platform and asking strangers to decide her worth. This is accountability." The words settled over Frostmere like clean snow. Marlene's hand trembled as she unclasped the silver moon from her cloak and placed it in Adrian's palm. For a moment, he simply looked at it, and Clara saw recognition flicker in his eyes. Not of the object, perhaps, but of the pattern carved into it. A crescent moon surrounded by 7 stars. Captain Rowan drew in a breath. The old royal healer's mark. Adrian turned the clasp over. On the back, worn nearly smooth by time, were 2 engraved initials and a line of tiny script. He read it silently, then looked at Clara with a gravity that made her heart stumble. "Evelyn Whitmore was not only a village healer," he said. "She was hiding you." Clara's world narrowed to the silver moon in his hand. Hiding. The word did not feel like betrayal. It felt like a door beginning to open. Before anyone could speak, hoofbeats sounded beyond the northern gate. 2 royal riders entered the square with snow flying from their cloaks. One carried a blue cloth bundle, stiff with frost. Captain Rowan took it and climbed the platform. Inside was the original ledger from beneath the Whitmore kitchen floorboards, the household seal, and a folded letter tied with white thread. Clara knew the thread. Her mother had used it for healing stitches, for sachets, for the hem of Clara's first festival dress. Adrian did not open the letter himself. He offered it to Clara. Her fingers shook as she took it. Across the front, in her mother's careful hand, were 4 words that made the entire square disappear. For Clara, when found. Clara held the letter as if it were alive. The white thread trembled between her fingers, and for one fragile moment, She was not standing in Frostmere before a crowd, but back in the healing room where her mother had hummed old northern songs while snow pressed against the windows. The envelope smelled faintly of lavender, dust, and the cedar chest beneath the kitchen floor. Adrian stood beside her without speaking. He did not ask to read it first. He did not take it from her hands. He simply waited, and that patience gave Clara the courage to pull the thread loose. The paper unfolded with a soft crackle. Her mother's handwriting filled the page in neat, sloping lines. Clara tried to read, but the letters blurred almost at once. She blinked hard, ashamed of the tears rising before so many people, until the little girl with the wooden rabbit reached up and slipped her small hand into Clara's. That tiny gesture steadied her more than any command could have. Clara drew a breath and lifted the letter toward Adrian. It was not surrender. It was trust. He accepted it with both hands, careful as if accepting something sacred. "May I read it aloud?" he asked. Clara nodded. The square held still. Adrian's voice was lower when he began, stripped of royal coldness, shaped instead by the weight of a mother speaking across years. "My dearest Clara, if this letter has found you, then the secret I tried to bury has risen before you were ready. Forgive me. I taught you silence because the world had already begun hunting the last moon healers, and your voice carried the old gift stronger than mine ever did." Clara's knees nearly weakened. Her silence, not brokenness, not shame, a shield. Adrian continued, each word falling into the market like a match held to dark paper. "When you were small, your songs could calm fever, fear, and pain. But power draws hungry eyes. I bound your voice with your consent when you were too young to remember, not to diminish you, but to keep you alive until the true king of the north could find you." A wave of murmurs moved through the square. Adrian paused, his silver eyes lifting briefly to Clara. Something in his face had changed, not shock, not pity, but recognition edged with awe. He read on. "The bracelet will wake when you stand near the bloodlines sworn to ours. The clasp will confirm the mark. The ledger will prove the theft. Trust the one whose wolf does not demand your voice before honoring your truth." Clara's breath caught. Adrian's hand tightened slightly on the page. The words had reached him too. Around them, the crowd was no longer merely watching a scandal. They were witnessing the careful unraveling of a life they had been taught to dismiss. Marlene gave a strained, breathless sound. That letter could have been written by anyone. Captain Rowan opened the ledger, her eyes moving quickly down the columns. "No," she said. "The entries match. Evelyn Whitmore recorded no debt to Harrow Trading. The first false charge appears 2 months after her death, entered under a different hand." Victor stepped back, but 2 royal guards were already near enough to stop him from disappearing into the crowd. No one touched him roughly. They did not need to. His own fear had rooted him in place. Clara stared at the page in Adrian's hands. "The true king of the north could find you." Her eyes lifted to him, and the world seemed to narrow until there was only snow, silver light, and the quiet space between them. Adrian folded the letter with reverence and returned it to her. "Your mother trusted the crown before the crown deserved it," he said. "That debt is mine to repay." Clara did not know what to do with a king who spoke of debt as honor instead of ownership. She clutched the letter to her chest, and the bracelet flared bright enough that every face around the platform glowed pale silver. The light rose in thin ribbons, not wild, not frightening, but graceful as breath on a cold window. It moved toward Adrian, stopping just short of his hand, waiting. The king looked at Clara, asking without words. She looked at the light, then at him, and slowly reached out. Their fingers met in the silver glow. The market vanished beneath a sudden hush deeper than silence. Clara felt warmth pass through her palm, steady and ancient, like a door opening inside both of them at once. Adrian's wolf answered without sound, not with possession, not with command, but with recognition. Clara. Her name moved through her heart, as if spoken by moonlight. Adrian inhaled sharply, and for the first time all morning, the winter crown looked almost shaken. Captain Rowan bowed her head. "Your Majesty," she whispered. "The old bond." Marlene's face went white. Victor stared as if the one coin in his hand had turned to ash. Adrian did not look away from Clara. "Not here," he said softly, as if protecting the moment from every greedy eye. Then he turned to Frostmere. and the king returned to his voice. This auction is closed. Every unlawful contract connected to hero trading is suspended under crown order. Every omega held here leaves under protection, not ownership. The crowd parted as royal guards moved with calm precision. Clara remained beside Adrian, still holding her mother's letter, still feeling the echo of her name inside her chest. She had not spoken, yet somehow, for the first time in her life, the whole North had heard her. The royal guards moved through Frostmere with quiet discipline, gathering ledgers, stamps, and folded contracts from Victor Harrow's tables while the crowd watched in uneasy silence. No one laughed now. The market that had felt so large when Clara stood alone on the block had become small beneath the weight of truth. She remained near the children, one hand holding her mother's letter, the other resting lightly over the silver bracelet as its glow faded to a soft pulse. The little girl with the wooden rabbit leaned against her side, no longer trembling. Clara looked down at her and felt something in her chest loosen again, a knot untying by inches. She had been called useless for so long that kindness had begun to feel like a secret habit, something to hide before others mocked it. But now the same kindness had stopped a king in his tracks. Captain Rowan approached Adrian with the ledger open in her hands. "Your Majesty, there are 32 names recorded under questionable transfer this season alone. Most were marked as debt settlements. Several are minors." A low sound moved through the crowd, not anger yet, but discomfort forced into the open. Adrian's face remained still, but the air around him sharpened. "Send riders to every northern checkpoint. No Harrow caravan leaves the territory. Any person listed as transferred by debt is to be found, sheltered, and questioned safely." "Yes, Your Majesty." Victor stood between two guards, no longer holding the coin. It lay on the table now, beside the torn ribbon and the royal seal, a tiny circle of copper surrounded by the ruins of his confidence. "I served existing demand," he said, trying to sound dignified and failing. "Families brought them. Pack signed them away. I only managed the paperwork." Clara looked at him then, really looked. For years, men like Victor had survived by making cruelty sound administrative. Transfer, settlement, dependent property, procedure. He had wrapped harm in clean words until people could pretend not to see it. Adrian seemed to read the same truth in the pause that followed. "Paperwork does not wash the stain from a choice," he said, "and law was never meant to give cowardice a uniform." Victor's mouth closed. Marlene, pale and rigid near the front of the crowd, turned toward Clara with eyes full of something too frantic to be remorse. "Clara," she said, and it was the first time in years she had spoken the name without contempt. "You know I did what I had to do. The winters were hard. Your mother left problems behind. I kept a roof over your head." Clara felt the old instinct rise, the one that told her to absorb the blame, to make herself smaller so the room could calm. But the bracelet warmed beneath her palm, and her mother's letter pressed against her heart. Not this time. She stepped forward slowly. Snow whispered around her skirt. The crowd parted just enough for her to stand facing Marlene. Clara did not speak. She reached out, not for Marlene, but for the silver moon clasp now resting in Adrian's hand. He gave it to her without hesitation. Clara held it up so everyone could see the 7-star mark. Then she crossed to the canvas screen where the rescued Omegas sat and fastened the clasp around the blanket of the youngest child. A murmur swept through Frostmere. Marlene stared, stunned, as the symbol she had worn for status became shelter for someone she would have ignored. Clara turned back, her eyes steady. Adrian understood before anyone else did. "Lady Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying the title with deliberate coldness. "She has chosen not to answer theft with possession. She has chosen restoration." Clara's throat tightened. Restoration. The word felt like sunlight she had not earned, but desperately needed. Marlene's composure cracked, not into tears, but into silence. This time, Clara did not fill it for her. Captain Rowan stepped beside the king. "The riders are ready." Adrian nodded, then looked to Clara. "The road to the capital is 28 miles through Mountain Pass. You and the others will ride under royal protection. There will be food, physicians, warm rooms, and no questions you do not wish to answer today." Clara searched his face for the hidden demand. There was none. Only space. Only choice. He added more quietly, "You do not owe me trust because fate has named something between us." The bond stirred gently at those words, not pulling, not forcing, simply present, like a candle in a window. Clara looked toward the northern road. For most of her life, that road had meant distance, fear, stories of a cold king in a dark citadel. Now it looked like the first line of a page not written by someone else. She nodded once. Adrian removed his black cloak and draped it around her shoulders with careful hands, never touching more than the wool. It was heavy, warm, and smelled faintly of pine and winter smoke. The crowd bowed as she stepped down from the auction platform, not because they understood her yet, but because the king walked beside her as if she had always deserved room in the world. At the edge of the square, Clara paused and looked back at the copper coin on the table. The snow had begun to cover it. Small, cold, forgotten. Then she turned away. The journey north began beneath a sky soft with falling snow. Clara rode in the second carriage with the rescued children, wrapped in Adrian Blackthorn's cloak, while Frostmere disappeared behind them, its tower fading into a pale blur of stone and smoke. No one spoke for the first mile. The children slept in little clusters beneath wool blankets, their faces finally loosening from fear into exhaustion. Captain Rowan rode ahead with 6 guards, while Adrian kept his horse near the carriage window, close enough to be seen, far enough not to cage the quiet. Clara watched him through the frost-laced glass. In the market, he had seemed carved from winter itself, all sharp lines and royal command. Here, on the open road, she saw something else in him. Restraint, patience, a loneliness so disciplined that most people would mistake it for coldness. The bond between them rested gently inside her, not demanding, not rushing, simply glowing like a lantern carried through fog. Clara lowered her eyes to her mother's letter, folded carefully in her lap. The words had changed everything and yet had not changed the simplest truth. She was still the girl who had learned to listen because speaking had been taken from her. She was still afraid, but fear felt different when it no longer stood alone. By late afternoon, the mountain pass opened before them, 28 miles of pine forest and white ridges leading toward the Blackthorn capital. The road curved beside a frozen river, its surface shining under the weak winter sun. One of the children woke and leaned against Clara's arm. "Are we really safe now?" she whispered. Clara looked at the girl's repaired wooden rabbit, then at the royal guards riding in steady formation around them. She nodded, and this time the gesture felt certain. The child smiled and fell asleep again. Outside, Adrian glanced toward the window as if he had felt the answer pass through the air. Their eyes met through the glass. Clara expected the old panic, the urge to disappear. Instead, she felt the strange, quiet strength of being allowed to remain visible. At dusk, the citadel appeared. It rose from the mountainside in dark stone and silver banners, its towers catching the last light like blades turned harmless by distance. The children stared in wonder. Clara stared too, but not at the walls. She stared at the open gates. No one dragged her through them. No one named a price. No one signed her life away. Adrian dismounted before the carriage stopped and opened the door himself. Gasps traveled among the waiting servants and guards, not because the act was grand, but because kings did not usually open doors for silent omegas in borrowed cloaks. Adrian offered his hand. Clara looked at it, then placed her fingers in his. Warmth rose between them, silver and soft, visible for only a breath. He did not tighten his hold. He simply helped her step down onto the snow-dusted courtyard. "Welcome to Blackthorn," he said quietly. "Not as a possession, not as a debt, as a guest under my protection, until you choose what comes next." Clara's throat ached. The locked room inside her trembled, not opening, not yet, but no longer sealed by fear alone. Around them, the rescued Omegas were guided inside by physicians and attendants with blankets and warm cider. Captain Rowan came. The world was moving because Clara had stood still long enough to be seen. She looked up at Adrian, then slowly removed the silver moon clasp from her palm. She had taken it back from shame, given it first to shelter a child. Now she held it out to him, not as surrender, but as proof. He understood. "Your mother's mark belongs to you," he said. Clara shook her head, then touched the clasp, the bracelet, her heart, and finally pointed toward the citadel doors where the children had vanished into warmth. Adrian's gaze softened with realization. "A house of healing," he said. "For every Omega the North failed to protect." Clara nodded. Snow caught in her lashes, but she did not look away. For the first time, the future did not arrive as a sentence passed by others. It arrived as a choice held in her own hands. Adrian bowed his head, not deeply enough for the court to call it ceremony, but enough for every watcher in the courtyard to understand respect. Then we will build it, he said, and the first law written in its name will be this: no one beneath the northern crown will ever be valued by coin again. The bond stirred gently, answering not with thunder, but with peace. Clara looked toward the open doors, toward warmth, work, and a life no auction paper could contain. She had entered Frostmere as a girl the world called silent. She entered Blackthorn as the last moon healer of the north, walking beside a king who had finally learned that true power did not claim the broken. It made room for them to rise.